am very excited to talk about cognitive dissonance and self-justification. And this class is when, as the young people like to say, the shit gets real. Because a lot of people signed up for this class because they heard it was easy. And it is easy. There's no labs, there's no brutal midterm or final, there's no finger wagging professor. But as we discussed in the first class, nothing shapes our lives as much as the questions we ask or the questions we refuse to ask throughout every stage of our life. And to really be curious and understand what self-justification is and how it affects all of our lives is really one of the most radical things that anybody could do. It's way harder and way more consequential than any physics final. So apparently I'm the perfect person to talk about this because according to my last girlfriend, I'm the king of self-justification. She literally called me that. She said, she pointed at me, I remember she pointed at me one day and was laughing at me and she's like, you teach about self-justification, you're the king of self-justification. But the truth is, we all self-justify. It's wired into our brain. We can't not do it. And when I first realized this, when I first learned about this subject, I was 19 at UCSC, and I found a book in a bookstore by Elliot Aronson entitled The Social Animal. And there was a chapter in it called Self-Justification, and I read it. And I wasn't in his class, even though he was a professor at UCSC, I didn't take any of his classes. I just read this chapter in this book, and it was more terrifying than any bad acid trip I'd ever taken. And there were many. But when you're having a really bad time on LSD or mushrooms, as harrowing as it might be, in the back of your mind you realize this is going to end soon and I'll get back to whatever normal is pretty soon. But when you learn about self-justification, you realize this doesn't end. This is everybody, every day, their entire life. We'll start today with revisiting our old friend the walrus. Then we'll really do a deep dive into cognitive dissonance and self-justification. Then I went to Elliot Aronson's home and we had a conversation about this, so I'll show you some clips about this. I want to talk about some variations on the theme of cognitive dissonance, different ways that we do it in our lives. And at the end, we'll talk about how do you handle the dissonance. So here's our old friend the walrus. As you'll recall from the paradox class a couple of weeks ago, walruses do a lot of amazing things. They flop around all day, they fight, they fish for clams, and that's basically it. I learned recently that actually walruses do some other really cool stuff.
Speak. Roar. Talk. Growl. Sputter. Rumble. Whistle. Bell.
That's amazing. I had no idea that walruses have that vocal range or that they could be trained. So, okay, walruses do a bunch of cool stuff, more than I ever realized. But as we discussed, walruses don't ask existential questions. They don't ponder the stars. And the three big questions are, where do we come from? Where do we go when we die? And what do we do while we're here? Right? It's only human beings who ask those questions. No animals ever worry about any of that because they live by instincts. But we live by our intellect, which allows us to ask questions about the world. And once you start asking questions, once human beings start asking questions, pretty soon you're going to hit a paradox. A paradox is an intellectual construct of the human animal. That's a way of putting it. And humans enter the realm of paradox whenever they're dealing with two opposing ideas or feelings. So here is the paradox of paradox. Are you ready for this? Even though paradox is a uniquely human experience, most people are repulsed by paradox and do their best to avoid it. Do you know what else walruses don't do? They don't smoke cigarettes. I used to smoke cigarettes for many years. I enjoyed the shit out of it. Marlboro Reds. A lot of cigarettes, a lot of coffee, a lot of conversation. It was fun. But this is what happens when smart people smoke. Because any smart person, and I'm defining smart by having graduated from the 3rd grade, knows that it's very smelly, it's very unhealthy, it's very expensive. So you're basically addicted and giving all this money to smell bad and thus have a smaller pool of potential mates, because a lot of people don't want to be dating an ashtray. So how do smart people handle doing something really stupid all day long? So what happens then is the person experiences cognitive dissonance. That's when you hold two inconsistent but equally true ideas in your head, and it creates a negative drive state. So for instance, just like hunger creates discomfort and you need to do something to resolve the discomfort, when you have cognitive dissonance, it's discomfort in the brain and you have to do something to reduce that discomfort. So when you have these two opposite ideas and they're forced into conflict, that conflict needs to be resolved somehow. And the way we do that is by updating one of the beliefs. So for instance, a cigarette smoker will say, well, I smoke American Spirit, they're organic. Or I'm going to quit soon. Or at least I'm not a heroin addict, that'd be so much worse. Or we're all going to die one day. Whatever story they tell themselves to make it less stupid so they can continue to smoke cigarettes. There is exceptions to the rule, not many though, because there are some people who are like, yeah, I know it's smelly, I know it's stupid, I fucking love it, so I'm gonna keep smoking. And those people, that's being self-aware, that's admitting the truth. But when most people will self-justify in order to reduce cognitive dissonance, and we do that by lying to ourselves about ourselves just under the level of conscious awareness. So here's another paradox. Self-justification helps us in so many ways because it preserves our sanity, our beliefs and our confidence and our self-esteem and general well-being. But at the same time, self-justification not only makes us into often hypocrites, but it limits the amount of positive emotion we can experience in life. Once you realize what cognitive dissonance and self-justification are, you start seeing it. You start seeing it in yourself, in other people, and you know what you become? That's right, the dude who walks out of the cave. All of a sudden, you got a whole new range of perspective about human behavior.
Welcome back to the show! I would like to talk about cognitive dissonance. It's when you hold two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time. Like,
I've been on food stamps and welfare. Anybody help me out? No.
I was on food stamps and welfare and nobody helped me. True. Pulled himself up by his bootstraps with the food stamps and the welfare. See, for most people, those two ideas fight like two rats in a bag in your head. It'll drive you crazy. But some people are able to square that circle. And those two opposing ideas end up making sweet love to each other like two rats in a bag. There are very few things, really very few things rats in a bag won't do. Here's another one. Republicans, like all Americans, dead. At the same time, they believe Barack Obama is incapable of doing anything right. So how are you going to get those rats to stop fighting and start
You know the thing about heroes? They don't brag.
The killing of Osama bin Laden, and he said he wasn't going to be gloating, and now he wants to make this victory lap with it. I just think it's distasteful.
It's the President of the United States who said he wasn't going to spike the football.
The Obama administration has tried to make it look like the president did everything, including fast roping out of the helicopter and pulling the trigger.
Okay, fine, you got our #1 enemy. But you bragged about it, so it doesn't count. I get the sense if Obama had pulled the trigger, Republicans would have complained he was taking jobs away from hardworking Navy SEALs.
So a helpful way to understand the idea of dissonance is through music. In music, there's the idea of consonant and dissonant. Consonant is the harmony of sounds. When you have these individual notes, you play them together in a chord, and they just work together in a way that makes us feel good. Dissonant is playing notes that don't really fit together in a way that makes us feel good. In fact, listening to it makes us kind of feel bad. It can drive you crazy after a while. My desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. Here's a great quote from Elliot Aronson. Dissonance is bothersome under any circumstance, but it is most painful to people when an important element of their self-concept is threatened. Typically, when they do something that is inconsistent with their view of themselves. And while I thought I was the king of self-justification, there's actually somebody who does it even a lot better than me. Right. I saw this clip that I'm about to show you during the primary. So this was before he even got the Republican nomination. And I saw this and I was like, oh shit, this crazy motherfucker might win.
Which is good, because I always want to be loved, you know? Like when I went on dates, if a woman dropped me, which happened often, I would always like to say, or at least in my own mind, that I dropped her. Does that make sense? So what happened makes me feel better.
Makes me feel better. When I saw that, I realized, oh my gosh, this guy just admitted in front of everybody that he lies to himself. But he did it in such a charming way. No politician would ever say anything like that. And he did it in such a way that everyone in the audience was like, yeah, I lied to myself too. And hey, he's just like us. He's one of us. We're all lying to ourselves. And that is a level of charm. It might be charm from the dark side, but he was real. As much of a pathological liar as he was real. Oh my God, speaking of real. This handsome young man's name is Ted Haggart. And at his peak, Ted Haggart was one of the most popular and powerful religious leaders in our country. He started his church in his basement in the early 80s. And 20 years later, he had 14,000 congregants in his mega church in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And he was also the president of the Evangelical Council. So he was the leader of this umbrella group of 30 million American Christians. And he had weekly meetings with President George W. Bush and his staff every Monday.
We've decided the Bible is the Word of God. We don't have to have a general assembly about what we believe. It's written in the Bible. All right? So we don't have to debate about what we should think about homosexual activity. It's written in the Bible. I think I know what you did last night. If you send me $1,000, I won't tell your wife. If you use any of this, I'll sue you.
Do you see what he did? He said, we believe that the Bible is the Word of God. We don't need to have a general assembly. We don't have to ask any questions. That shuts down critical thinking. That is, stop thinking, just believe. Don't use your brain. And so, as my hero Christopher Hitchens said, the sleep of reason brings forth monsters.
Across the nation, a leading evangelical Christian pastor at the forefront of the crusade against same-sex marriage steps down from the pulpit amid allegations of a long-term sexual affair with another man. The Reverend Ted Haggard resigning as president of the powerful National Association of Evangelicals, which represents 30 million American Christians. He has also left his post as the pastor of the New Life Church in Colorado Springs, while the church panel investigates charges he had a 3-year affair with a male escort and that he used methamphetamine during their sexual encounters. Reverend Haggard, married with 5 children, denies the allegations.
I've never said that I'm perfect, but I haven't had sex with a man in Denver, and I've been faithful to my wife. I've never had a gay relationship with anybody, and I'm steady with my wife. I'm faithful to my wife, and so I don't know if this is election year politics or if this has to do with the marriage amendment or what it is.
The man making the accusation, 49-year-old Mike Jones, he says Haggard paid him for sex, and they secretly met about once a month for 3 years. He says Haggard's stand against gay marriage prompted him to come forward.
It's been hard for me because emotionally I just don't want to destroy someone. But this story needs to be out because it's so wrong. People may look at me and what I've done as immoral, but I think I had to do the moral thing in my mind, and that is expose someone who is preaching one thing but doing the opposite behind everybody's backs.
Despite the Reverend Haggard's public denial, the pastor who's running the church now, Reverend Ross Parsley, says Haggard did make an admission of indiscretion.
There has been some admission of indiscretion, not admission to all of the material that has been discussed, but there is an admission of some guilt, and that's what we're working with the outside overseers who are working with Pastor Ted and his family to investigate what's happened here.
The allegations come as voters in Colorado and 7 other states prepare to weigh in on amendments that would ban gay marriage.
Hey, I won't tempt you. Do what you want. I'm here to make you okay with it and to help you blame someone else. After his downfall, you know what Mr. Haggard did? He became a reality TV star. He had his own show on TLC, the same network I was on. And then he and his wife, who stayed with him, and family moved to Arizona and started a new church, and that's what he's doing right now. But self-justification isn't just for people who are ethically compromised or emotionally immature. It is across the board for every human being, even the smartest ones. Case in point, Charles Darwin. He was deeply religious, and his observation of evolution conflicted horribly with his religious background, and he had a lot of cognitive dissonance. And in his autobiography, he very clearly talks about his attempt to self-justify this. I'm going to read a few paragraphs from this, and it starts with a quick little kind of overview or bio of him. Charles Darwin, the founder of modern biology, 1809 to 1882, was another of those who did not abandon his religious views with a light heart. Darwin even considered the priesthood as a young man and embarked on his study of the natural world in the belief that it demonstrated the glory of God. Having voyaged to South America and the Galapagos Islands on board the good ship Beagle, however, he found himself confronting the evidence of evolution by natural selection. His Origin of the Species, published in 1859, was very reluctant to accept its own implications and referred throughout to creation without mentioning evolution. Now I'm going to read from the actual autobiography. During these 2 years, October 1836 to January 1839, I was led to think much about religion. While on board the Beagle, I was quite orthodox, and I remember being heartily laughed at by several of the officers for quoting the Bible as an unanswerable authority on some point of morality. But I was very unwilling to give up my belief. I feel sure of this now, for I can well remember often and often inventing daydreams of old letters between distinguished Romans and manuscripts being discovered at Pompeii or elsewhere, which confirmed in the most striking manner all that was written in the Gospels. But I found it more and more difficult, with free scope given to my imagination, to invent evidence which would suffice to convince me. Thus, disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. The rate was so slow, I felt no distress. Another great thinker who wrote about experiencing cognitive dissonance in his autobiography is Malcolm X. And Malcolm X is particularly fascinating because in his early life, he was a grifter, hustler, dope dealer in Harlem. Then he went to prison for burglary. And while he was in prison, he was introduced to Elijah Muhammad, who was the leader of the Nation of Islam, which was the first and really only organized Muslim group in the United States in the late 60s. This is like 1960. So Malcolm X converted to Islam while in jail, and then after that started going to the library and just reading all the time. In fact, he talked about reading a lot of the Greeks, Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, and he became educated about world history. And it's really fascinating because he says when he went into jail, he could write maybe 30 words. That was the extent of his vocabulary skills as far as writing. And when he left prison soon afterwards, he became a public intellectual with an extraordinarily crystal clear voice and mission. And it was nobody really like him at all ever. No one like him before and no one like him afterwards. He was basically like a verbal ninja.
Tonight, Front Page Challenge welcomes the outspoken Negro leader, Malcolm X.
Whether you have or not, and I think probably you have sometimes, it seemed to me, been preaching hate to meet hate.
I don't advocate any kind of hate.
But there's a lot of talk that sounds very much like it.
No, I think that the guilt complex of the American white man is so profound until when you begin to analyze the real condition of the black man in America, instead of the American white man eliminating the causes that create that condition, he tries to cover it up by accusing his accusers of teaching hate. But actually, they're just exposing him for being responsible for what exists.
Well, that's something of an argument, but I've heard speeches made by some of the people of your group. I think I've heard you make speeches. It seemed to me that you were advocating, well, I would have to describe, I think, as violence.
I don't in any way encourage black people to go out and initiate acts of aggression indiscriminately against whites. But I do believe that the black man in the United States and any human being, anywhere, is well within his right to do whatever is necessary, by any means necessary, to protect his life and property, especially in a country where the federal government itself has proven that it is either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of those human beings.
So once Malcolm X had become famous, he had found something out about Elijah Muhammad, who he was loyal to for all those years. He found out that Elijah Muhammad was lying because he had impregnated 3 or 4 of his secretaries who were in their early 20s. So this is the context, coming to grips with this truth that Malcolm X just finds out about his hero and leader, created cognitive dissonance. So I'll read from the autobiography right now. Every second of my 12 years with Mr. Muhammad, I'd been ready to lay down my life for him. The thing to me worse than death was betrayal. I could conceive death. I couldn't conceive betrayal. Not of the loyalty which I'd given to the Nation of Islam and to Mr. Muhammad. I don't think I could say anything which better testifies to my depth of faith in Mr. Muhammad than that I totally and absolutely rejected my own intelligence. I simply refused to believe. Both in New York and Chicago, non-Muslims who I knew began to tell me indirectly that they had heard, or they would ask if I'd heard. I would act as if I had no idea whatsoever of what they were talking about, and I was grateful when they chose not to spell out what they knew. In the way that the human mind can do, somehow I would slide over admitting to myself the ugly fact, even as I began dealing with it. I went around knowing that I looked to them like a total fool. I felt like a total fool, out there every day preaching, and apparently not knowing what was going on right under my nose in my own organization, involving the very man I was praising so. To look like a fool unearthed emotions I hadn't felt since my Harlem Hustler days. The worst thing in the hustler's world was to be a dupe. That's one of the characteristics I don't like about myself. If I meet a problem, I feel I can't solve it, I shut it out. I make believe that it doesn't exist. But it exists. I can't describe the torments I went through. The first direct death order was how finally I began to arrive at my psychological divorce from the Nation of Islam. That is, he finally was able to admit the truth once he found out that they put a death hit on him. And eventually, they killed him. It wasn't the Ku Klux Klan that killed Malcolm X, it was the Nation of Islam. So what's fascinating is that Malcolm X and Charles Darwin basically had completely different lives, different centuries, different ethnic backgrounds, different passions, completely different experiences. They had one thing in common, or actually two things in common. One was they experienced cognitive dissonance because it happens to every single human being, no matter how powerful your brain is. And secondly, the other thing that they share in common is that they were both born before cognitive dissonance theory was kind of discovered and explained. And we experience the exact same type of dynamic, but at least now we are aware that there's this thing called cognitive dissonance, so we could be actually aware that we are self-justifying. So most people, doesn't matter if you're a scientist or a fake evangelical preacher hypocrite, most people, when directly confronted with evidence that they're wrong, don't want to change their mind. They don't want to change their point of view. And in fact, they'll do the opposite. They'll justify their course of action even more. So forced into conflict, we need to resolve it somehow. And our brain is adaptive. Something's going to have to be pushed up higher and something's going to have to be repressed lower. So the need to reduce dissonance is a universal mental mechanism, but it doesn't mean that we're doomed to be controlled by it. And this is a great quote from the Elliot Aronson book. None of us can live without making blunders. To err is human, but humans then have a choice between covering up and confessing up. So here's a couple examples from my own personal life. I experience self-justification every day, I guess even every morning, when I wake up and I look at my bong and I think, should I take a hit out of that thing? And then there's a little voice, little angel dude who's like, no, the students need you. You need to focus and get the work done. And then there's the other dude who's dressed in red and he's like, but you do a better job if the bong helps you. And so then these just two voices go in my head, and until finally I'm like, well, okay. So, you know, I'm easily seduced. But here's an example of a time where I felt that I was doing self-justification and I wasn't. I was actually kind of like aware of what was happening, and I'll explain to you. So I've worked for Martha Stewart a bunch of times.
Adi Samek is here and he's mesmerizing us with his balloon technique. What's next?
Check this out. This is the dinghy.
Uh-oh. I can see why children are fascinated with this, because I'm an adult and I'm fascinated.
Yeah.
And do you know what you're making, or are you just making something?
Well, all hats come out different because each person's different.
So you have the best lung power in America, right? Or in the world, right?
Lip power.
Lip power, but lung power too. Oh, I like this one.
Yeah, once you practice
I
a lot,
like
you sit in
that.
your room, lock the door, and practice for years.
Did your mother ask you, what the hell are you doing in your room?
They were a little concerned at first, yeah. In fact, they're still sometimes are concerned, to be honest with you.
And later, Adi is going to show us how to make balloon flower party decorations for our, guess what, flower party. Stay tuned.
Then about 2 years ago, I got a call from her producers that she has a new show with Snoop Dogg, and can I come on and do some sort of balloon thing? And I said, okay, I'll go check out the show. and it was horrible. It's so bad. I could watch like 3 minutes of it. It was just so canned and saccharine, and I didn't want to be involved in television anymore. I'd done it and I was kind of repulsed by it, but a part of me wanted to get back into it, or thought I should get into it. A part of me was like, no, it's poisonous, stay away. And so I already had cognitive dissonance just about, the future of my career. What am I going to do? Then when they called me to be on the show, it really made me have to really question it. And I couldn't tell. Am I scared to get back into television, or am I smart enough to know that it's not good and toxic and I should avoid it? Is it wisdom or is it fear? I can't tell because they both look the same right now. So, and they feel the same kind of. So anyway, what I did was I took a time out and I went and saw my therapist, who I only see like maybe 3 or 4 times a year. But whenever I have a bottleneck issue that comes up and I want a perspective to help. So I stopped and I went, told her the whole thing, and I asked her, am I self-justifying? Am I just making this up? Am I being motivated by fear? So I saw my therapist and I decided this isn't for me. I wasn't self-justifying. I really just wasn't feeling it. So I passed, and they called my friend Tawny Bubbles in Las Vegas, and she came and she did a really great job. And now I'd like to share with you a conversation I had with Elliot Aronson in his home, in his living room in Santa Cruz. Elliot really is the dude when you talk about cognitive dissonance. When he was a grad student at Stanford, his mentor, Leon Fessinger, is the one who came up with the concept. But Elliot really took it from an obscure academic concept and built it into a very robust theory of mind. And it's very well established in the field of psychology. And it's left the university, and now regular people talk about cognitive dissonance in a way that was unimaginable in the past. And it's in large part due to Elliot. So I've always admired him. I know his writing really changed my life when I was 19. So I was really excited to meet him. Elliot was a professor at UCSC from the early years to he retired recently. And he also started losing his eyesight about 10 years ago. It slowly started diminishing, and now he is like 90-something% blind. So it was easier for me to go to his house, and we did this interview there. But he's super humble, super insightful. It was an honest, genuine pleasure to hang out and talk to him.
You remember when you first came across the phrase cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, it's when I met Leon Festinger, who invented it. I didn't know about it before, but when I became a graduate student at Stanford, I arrived in 1956, which as a first-year graduate student, which was the same year Leon Festinger arrived, and he was in the process of writing a book called A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance.
Is this something, a theory that he actually developed on his own, or how did he start piecing it together?
He developed it on his own. What he told me was that he was studying rumor transmission and stumbled across the finding that there was a big earthquake in India. And the people who were living a few miles away from the epicenter started to spread rumors about greater disasters about to happen. There was going to be a tidal wave and a typhoon and all kinds of things. And he was wondering, why would people do that? It's not, why do people want to build up their anxiety? And what he realized is that the people living really close to the epicenter had different kind of rumors, that people were coming to help, that the Red Cross would soon be there, etc. But if they lived 7 or 8 miles away, they had these rumors of greater disasters. And so he realized that what he figured out was that they had an awful lot of anxiety, but no justification for it. So they were inventing justifications, and that was his first notion.
Why do you think self-justification is hardwired into the human psyche?
It has survival value from a Darwinian perspective. If you're a caveman and you're visiting, if there's a party in the next cave and you spill wine all over yourself and you worry about it, and gee, people think I'm a clumsy bastard and it really wasn't my fault, the guy knocked it over. If you're worrying about that, the next time you go out to hunt tigers, you're liable to get yourself killed. Whereas if you're good at reducing dissonance, at self-justifying it, saying it wasn't my fault, then you go out, you hunt a tiger, and you kill him. It's as simple as that. If you're not preoccupied with the impression you're making or the mistakes you made or anything like that, but you're really good at justifying, you're going to have children who are also good at justifying.
And so, in essence, it allows you to sleep at night and it lets you to focus on the jobs you need to do to survive.
Yeah, it does let you sleep at night, and it does leave you less vulnerable, indeed.
The paradox is, though, that it also limits your life and creates a certain mentality that makes you more susceptible to unpleasant things where you have to justify even more.
Absolutely.
So it really puts paradox in the center of human behavior, not a more linear understanding of why people behave the way
It's
they
a
do.
paradox only if you don't understand how the human mind works. The human mind doesn't see it as a paradox, of course. The human mind is trying to convince, human beings are forever trying to convince ourselves that we are just, that we are smart, that we are moral people, competent people. So when we do something that's unjust, immoral, incompetent, or stupid, it creates dissonance, and we try to reduce it by justifying what we did.
I have some more clips of the conversation with Elliot that I'll show you in just a moment, but I want to take this brief moment to discuss some variations on the cognitive dissonance theme. In particular, there's 3 corollaries of cognitive dissonance: confirmation bias, information inflation, and rationalizing. I'm going to explain all of them right now. Confirmation bias is the tendency that people have to focus on evidence that confirms their existing views and to ignore or discount information that may challenge those views. I witness confirmation bias often when I go home and hang out with my family, because my mom is very pro-Israel, my brother is very pro-Palestine. So when I talk to them, I notice both of them, even though they have opposite positions, are doing the same thing. They will read the news, but they are either consciously or unconsciously attracted to articles that confirm and prove their pre-existing opinions and ignore the articles that would make them challenge their pre-existing opinions. So everybody does confirmation bias. You know who else does it a lot? Academics. Here's a fascinating exchange between Brene Brown and Mark Maron on his WTF podcast. And they're talking about how in her research of vulnerability, she was actually trying to justify why she didn't need to be vulnerable through her research. Check it out.
Now, let me come around it this way. I assume that you came from some sort of out of control environment that eventually drove you to not have that happen in your life.
I think that's fair.
And that, you know, that your interest, like as you said in your work, is, you know, like, how do I get around this vulnerability thing? What research do I have to do to not make to maintain my defensiveness in a righteous way?
This is so uncomfortable. Yeah, that's exactly what I did. Yeah, I did not want the answer to be the answer. I wanted to do the research to defend my way of being in the world.
Right.
For sure.
Right. And that it blew up in your face, which led to a breakthrough and a sort of like, you know, epiphany of how it all fits together. Shame and vulnerability and the repercussions of that and how they ripple through all levels of human activity.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that I spent my entire life trying to outrun and outsmart vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think my plan was to get the empirical evidence to support my way of being in the world.
And this is an amazing quote from the psychologist Bill McGuire. He said, "An experiment does not test whether a hypothesis is true. It tests whether the experimenter is a sufficiently ingenious stage manager to prove that the hypothesis is true." And Sherlock Holmes knew this before anybody. Back in the late 19th century, Arthur Conan Doyle's character said in one of his books, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." And the fact is now that the majority of people get their news from social media, and the social media wants you to stay engaged. So they're going to give you content that they know you want to see. So they're going to just keep feeding you the things you already believe in order for you to not be bored and stay engaged. Look at this article from the Collegiate Times. Digital algorithms are reinforcing confirmation bias. The strongest bias in American politics is not a liberal bias or a conservative bias. It's a confirmation bias, or the urge to believe only things that confirm what you already believe to be true. And then there's imagination inflation. So the more you imagine something, the more likely you are to inflate it in an actual memory, adding subtle detail that didn't actually happen. And this, I experienced this just recently when I saw an old girlfriend and we were talking about, the last days of our relationship, and we just remembered things completely different, where we were the ones who were, virtuous, and the other person was, fatally flawed. Here's a great line from the Elliot Aronson book. "Between the conscious lie to fool others and the unconscious self-justification to fool ourselves lies a fascinating gray area, patrolled by the unreliable, self-serving historian, memory. False memories allow us to forgive ourselves and justify our mistakes, but sometimes at a high price, an inability to take responsibility for our lives." And then there's rationalizing. And there's a difference between rationalizing and reasoning. Rationalizing is when you start with the conclusion and then figure out the arguments that defend the conclusion, as opposed to reasoning, which focuses on the process moving forward. You start with some premises, and then through logic, you arrive at the conclusion. So for instance, let's just say you work for the city of Santa Cruz and they gave you the job, hey, figure out why there's so many homeless people. And for the sake of argument, let's just say that you thought all homeless people were crazy and chose to be homeless. If that's what you really thought, and that is what you wanted your conclusion to be, then you will rationalize and look for the proof that will support your theory. Whereas the other way is if you started with just doing research, looking for the data, there might be, well, it's expensive to live in Santa Cruz, and the mental facilities closed down, and the weather's nice, and you start coming up with all these potentials and see where that leads you. So it's a reasoning, rationalizing, it's a matter of direction. They're similar, but actually opposite. And of course, in Mary's interview about the search for meaning, she said, any explanation will do as long as it poses as an acceptable explanation. It doesn't need to have anything to do with reality as long as it has the power to affect people and make them believe it. We have this marvelous ability to make excuses and to explain things falsely. We won't live without meaning, but we are satisfied with very dubious meanings. So the important thing to remember is that the old saying, seeing is believing, like if I don't believe there's Bigfoot, I have to see Bigfoot to believe there's a Bigfoot. Okay, that's true. Seeing is believing, but the opposite is also true. Believing is seeing. Everything you look for and all that you perceive has a way of proving whatever you believe. Here are a couple more clips of Elliot and I in his living room.
The difference between reducing dissonance by justifying your past behavior and learning from your mistakes is the difference between leading a moral, sensible life and engaging in ways of shoring up your ego.
So everybody wants to think that they're moral, decent, competent people. And so
Right.
everybody has this ability to do self-justification built into their psyche. Now,
That's
one thing-
hardwired.
It's
That's-
hardwired.
Yeah.
One thing Mary would say is that intelligence and courage are not distributed evenly amongst people. That is, some people are just born with intelligence, and some people are born with courage, and some people aren't. That's not to say they're totally incompetent, but they just
Right.
don't have that special, especially courage.
Well,
you can't fake courage.
Yeah.
And it seems from what you're saying to really grapple with these issues and shine the light on your own behavior takes a degree of courage.
Well, it does take courage, but it also takes a cognitive mindset or the ability to change your mindset. Because the issue for me is we all differ in intelligence, but almost everybody believes they're more intelligent than the average person. Okay, almost everybody believes that, which is why this incredible need to avoid doing something stupid or avoid being thought of as being stupid. And the courage comes, my courage comes when I say to myself, I've done a really stupid thing. That doesn't make me a stupid person. It makes me a smart person who did a stupid thing. Okay, now that's a cognitive mindset that may or may not have anything to do with courage. It's a way of dealing with your own issues. In other words, instead of justifying it, let me just back up a second. I think that one of the reasons that people justify their behavior is they're fearful that their behavior may define them. Okay? So if you do something immoral, you want to justify it and convince yourself that it really wasn't immoral, or that stupid bastard deserved the terrible thing you did to him, because you don't want to think of yourself as an immoral person, and you don't want other people to think you're an immoral person. But if you can say to yourself, I did an immoral action, but that's not who I am. It may take courage, or it may take a way of looking at yourself in a way that shows some self-compassion.
One thing I've noticed a lot is that women want to be with a man who's vulnerable but not weak. And they see a distinction between the two.
Oh, yeah.
Most men just think vulnerability and weakness are the same thing.
Yeah.
And the average guy's idea is I have this sweater, and if I pull one thread, if I admit I have a problem and I pull this thread, who knows if this thread will just keep going and the whole sweater will unravel. So it's better to pretend not only is there not a loose thread here, this isn't even a sweater, it's just armor. And you can't even begin to, get at me.
Yeah.
So it's very rare to find someone who's really willing to begin to admit their small problems, because who knows what it could lead to.
Right. Right. Now you're defining that as courage, or Mary did, and it could be. I don't dispute that it's courage, but I think it's just thinking out of the box. As kids, we grew up as boys in a tough world where the strongest kid is the better kid, and you either better learn how to fight or learn how to run, but you don't want to show any weakness or vulnerability because the other kids will take advantage of it. If, like me, you're somebody who cried easily, that was a huge handicap, because I get into a dispute about whether the guy was safe or out at first base, and if I'm sure I'm right, and yet the umpire calls it the wrong way, at 10 years old, I was apt to burst into tears, and that would be humiliating. That's where we learn that stuff. You learn to not cry when you're upset. You learn not to show anything that could possibly be construed as weakness. But then you get older, and you learn that in order to experience the world, you really have to be vulnerable to it. vulnerable to the joy and vulnerable to the pain. And it's a bonus that most women find that attractive in men.
Yeah.
But that's something we have to learn, and we have to unlearn that. But I think your sweater metaphor is a very good one. It becomes a suit of armor, and you sure don't want to admit that there's a loose thread that can pull the whole thing down. Yeah.
Self-justification has a positive role in our lives in that it makes us just able to function. But it has a negative role in our lives that it can minimize our quality of life because we don't evolve into better, smarter, stronger, more loving people.
We don't learn from mistakes that we made if we're covering them up. And that's the major problem. And so, look, we make thousands of small decisions every week. If we really had to tussle with them all the time, did I do the right thing? Did I get the right airline ticket? Or was there a better price somewhere? Or we wouldn't be able to function. So we have to say, yeah, I did the best I could with a lot of these things. The art and the skill is being able to quickly identify which decisions really need to be looked at and which decisions could be disastrous. And then how do we, if we make the wrong decision, when is it important to really look at that and take responsibility for it? And when is it just as easy to brush it off because there's no real consequence to it? And I think that is one of the keys to healthy living, I think. You can't, like the caveman, you can't be fretting about everything that you did that might have been wrong. Sometimes you just have to reduce distance and say, best I could have done, and let it go. But there are other times when it has really dire consequences for yourself and for others, and those are things that really need to be looked at and need to be owned up to.
So there's an art in assigning value and importance to all the different decisions we have to make in life.
Yeah. Implicitly. You don't go around saying, well, that's a 2, that's an 8, that's a 9. No, but implicitly you know what decisions are important and what decisions aren't important.
I got an email from Elliot where he told me he actually went to the museum in Santa Cruz to check out the giant balloon elephant and the 6 blind guys. And then he sent me this picture of him with the elephant. So I want to end today with an example that we can all relate to. I was thinking, what can we discuss that everyone can say, oh yeah, I've experienced that. And because everyone's trips everyone's so unique and they've got different hang-ups and different desires. And I realized, okay, we all eat. And people get really touchy when you start talking about their food. So I thought we would talk about what we eat in the context of cognitive dissonance. And I am not an activist professor, okay? I'm not trying to get you to be a certain way. My job really is to help you get in the habit of asking the questions that will help your life suck less. Whatever you decide is your decision, but I think this is an important question and an important conversation. And that is our relationship with animals as pets and as food. So let's start with the pets. This is really cute. Who's going to say that's not cute? And that's like totally adorable. So deep. And I don't even like little dogs, but that thing is just like a little furry ball of happiness. In fact, Mary once told me that she didn't trust anybody who didn't love dogs. And here's a lady who saves wounded baby goats. I found her on Instagram. Her handle is Goats of Anarchy.
Good job. Try to take the goats that I know no one else will take, that are on their way to be euthanized. This is my house of goats, the goat hospital. The most extreme length I have gone to save a baby goat is with our goat Lawson, who was born with a gigantic hole in his heart. So this is what we have to drive through for the next couple of hours to get Lawson to the cardiologist. But we can't miss this appointment. Right, buddy? Gonna get your little heart fixed. They told me he had a few weeks to live and that my only hope in saving him would be to find a pediatric heart surgeon for babies, for human babies. So I posted this on our Instagram, and within a couple of hours, I had a pediatric heart surgeon say, oh my gosh, that's me, and if all goes well, we will probably be the first baby goat with open heart surgery. You're so good at running.
So all of that obviously is super adorable. My point here is that we can compartmentalize the way we feel about animals. We can think they're adorable, inspiring family members, or they're lunch. So what I'd like to do now is show you this PETA propaganda film called Meet Your Meat. And what they did was and PETA is the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. So what they did was they snuck in video cameras to slaughterhouses, and most people had never seen footage like this before.
What you are about to see is beyond your worst nightmares. But for animals raised on modern intensive production farms and killed in slaughterhouses, it is cold, inescapable reality. Once you see for yourself the routine cruelty involved in raising animals for food, you'll understand why millions of compassionate people have decided to leave meat off their plates for good. Chickens are probably the most abused animals on the face of the planet. They are crammed into filthy sheds by the tens of thousands, immersed in their own excrement among the corpses of other birds who died of heart attacks or stress. Some even die of starvation brought on by becoming crippled from growing so large, so fast that their legs can't withstand the weight, which makes them unable to reach food. After being genetically manipulated and fed antibiotics to promote unnaturally rapid growth, their hearts, lungs, and legs often break down under the added weight. Heart attacks and crippling leg deformities are far too common. A PETA investigation found this farmer killing sick and injured turkeys by beating them with a metal rod and then tossing them aside, leaving them still conscious and suffering. This was deemed legal and standard by the industry. This undercover video shows the standard method of gathering chickens for slaughter. After enduring weeks in filthy, crowded conditions, the animals are loaded onto trucks and taken through extreme weather conditions without food or water to slaughterhouses. Where they are snapped into shackles by their fragile legs and have their throats slit, often while still conscious. Many are scalded alive in the feather removal tanks. If you thought it couldn't be any worse, think again. Between 5 and 11 hens are crammed into tiny wire cages during egg production. The animals might go insane from the oppressive conditions and attack one another, so their beaks, which are filled with nerve endings, are painfully seared off with a hot blade. These hens are so crowded that they are unable to spread even one wing during their entire miserable lives. They are unable to do anything natural, such as dust bathing or foraging through the grass. It takes an average of 34 hours in these conditions to produce just one egg. When egg production drops, producers often shock the bodies of the worn-out birds into another laying cycle by withholding food for up to 14 days. Many die of starvation. Because their bones are so weak and their bodies so worn down, up to 90% of hens have broken bones or are hemorrhaging by the time they make it to slaughter. Cattle are castrated, have their horns chopped off, and are repeatedly branded, all without painkillers. At auctions, electric prods are used to torment the frightened animals into going where the workers want them to go. The USDA allows meat from animals with cancerous lesions and pus-filled wounds to be certified as USDA pure, so injuries and illnesses often go untreated. After enduring close to a year crammed into feedlots, cattle are loaded onto transport trucks and shipped through all weather extremes. At slaughter, their throats are slit open, and many are skinned and dismembered while still fully conscious. Dairy cows have it even worse. Even though they give milk for the same reason that humans do, for their babies, on today's dairy farms, mother cows are treated as nothing more than milk machines. 40% of dairy cows are lame by the time they reach the slaughterhouse. They are hooked up to machines a few times per day, machines that often injure them. At the end of their lives, they are either sent straight to slaughter or are sold for slaughter at cattle auctions. More than 100,000 cows are unable to walk off the transport trucks every year, yet they are slaughtered for human food anyway. At a fraction of their natural lifespan, they're shipped to slaughter. Most hamburger in this country comes from spent dairy cows. Cows give milk for their offspring, not for human beings. These mother cows are impregnated annually to keep the milk flowing, and their babies are torn from them shortly after birth, which causes both of them profound distress. Many of the males are sold to veal farmers, who cram them into tiny crates where they cannot turn around or even comfortably lie down. If you're consuming milk, you're supporting the veal industry. Veal calves, who can barely walk because their muscles have atrophied from a lack of use and an anemia-inducing diet, are also often sold at auctions. Confined to tiny stalls that don't even allow mother pigs to turn around for most of their pregnancy, the first time that these animals will breathe fresh air is when they are on the back of a truck headed for the slaughterhouse. Many will go insane from the complete lack of stimulation. Shortly after birth, baby pigs have their ears mutilated, the ends of their teeth chopped off, their tails cut off, and they are also castrated, all without any painkillers. Pigs who aren't growing quickly enough, called fall-behinds, are killed by being slammed headfirst against the concrete floor, as you see here. Like chickens, pigs grow so quickly that they can't walk normally. Their limbs simply can't sustain their drug-induced bulk. Many pigs become ill or injured, but are not put out of their misery because as long as they're still alive, they have a chance of generating profits for the company if they can make it to slaughter. Those who obviously can't make it to the slaughterhouse are shot with a captive bolt gun so that they don't waste the company's money by eating feed. Moving pigs by beating them with gate rods is one of the more common forms of abuse. Pigs are often packed so tightly together on unventilated trucks that their limbs snap under the weight of other terrified animals, and they sometimes freeze to the sides of the truck or die of dehydration. In fact, 400,000 pigs who are unable to walk off the truck arrive at the slaughterhouses each year. 100,000 arrive dead. These are industry figures. Some speculate that the real numbers are much higher. After being electrically prodded and forced onto the killing floor, improper stunning causes pigs to endure having their throats slit while they are still awake. Some are burned alive in the scalding tank that is used for hair removal. Please think about what you've seen. Every time we sit down to eat, we make a choice. Please choose vegetarianism. Do it for the animals, do it for the environment, and do it for your health. To find out more, check out PETA's vegetarian website for a free vegetarian starter kit and share this with a friend. Thank you.
So again, here's this great quote from Eliot. Dissonance is bothersome under any circumstance, but it is most painful to people when an important element of their self-concept is threatened, typically when they do something that is inconsistent with their view of themselves. So the cognitive dissonance here is that people say, I'm a good person, I am not a cruel person, and I love animals. That's their self-image. But then on the flip side, as long as they're eating random roast beef sandwiches, right? That's different than like farm raised, but as long as you're complicit in the factory farming industrial machine, you are complicit in the torture of an animal, many animals, and the rationale is it's okay to be cruel as long as it's tasty and I enjoy it and I don't have to think too much about it. So I want you to really think about this. It's not pleasant. It's not a pleasant thing to think about at all. But it's important, not just for what you put in your body or how you interact with the world, but to what extent are you delusional about the most fundamental things in your life, which in this case is what you put in your body and what you put in your heart. So I want you guys to discuss this in the groups, and the question is, do you have any cognitive dissonance in your relationship with animals? And if yes, how do you handle it? And if no, are you self-justifying to a hazardous degree? And you might not be self-justifying. You could legitimately say human beings are superior. It sucks that animals are tortured, but we're superior. There's no cognitive dissonance in that. You accept that there's something unpleasant happening. And another reason it's important to think about this is because a richer understanding of how and why our minds work as they do is really the first step toward breaking the self-justification habit. And then Aronson has this great point in the book. If you admit a mistake when it's the size of an acorn, it's easier to repair it than when it becomes the size of a tree with deep, wide-ranging roots. So the assignment this week, you probably saw this coming from a mile away. After reading Elliot Aronson's work on cognitive dissonance and self-justification, write an honest evaluation of how you lie to yourself about yourself. The goal here is to be self-reflective, genuine, and step outside of your comfort zone. The majority of time of this assignment should be spent in contemplation of the ideas in the reading and of your own behavior. The actual writing should be done quickly, with more of an emphasis on describing the patterns in your life and less on offering any solutions, right? First, you have to be aware of what is happening before you can fix it. This paper can be as long as you need it to be, but don't forget the general rule, less is more. And I'd like to leave you today with a quote from the world of medieval alchemy. You find what you need where you least want to look. That's for real.